How was last night?
Scary. I live in the high-rise right back here, and I'd seen them as they came down Lake Street. But then they turned and started coming over here, and I'm sitting out looking out my window. And they went straight to Office Max, the dollar store, and every store over here that I go to. I have nowhere to go now. I have no way to get there because the buses aren't running. These people did this for no reason. It's not going to bring George back here. George is in a better place than we are. And last night, I'm going to be honest, I wish I was where George was because this is ridiculous. These people are tearing up our livelihood.
That's heartbreaking. Who did these George Floyd riots hurt the most? Dustin Grage is here. He's a Minnesota Republican strategist. Dustin shared that clip on his Twitter, which is Grage Dustin, Grage Dustin. Dustin, I'm grateful you're here, and you know all things about Tim Walz. We've talked about a lot today so far, but if you don't mind, I'd like to focus on George Floyd. What is your assessment on his reaction to the George Floyd riots?
I mean, just quite frankly, it was just completely inadequate and inferior of a response that we should have seen. If this was a Republican governor, it would have been a far different response. I like to pick on my favorite governor in this country, like most Republicans, that'd be Ron DeSantis. But what's the state that didn't have any of these riots, that didn't have any of these issues, burning buildings, ravaged communities? None of this happened in the state of Florida. But in Minnesota, it's just a very different story because the radical left here just runs the show, quite frankly. And if you go back to Tim Walz's record in Congress, he perceived himself as a moderate when he was in the 1st Congressional District of Minnesota. And he legislated pretty fairly to that point until he had political aspirations that were higher. And of course, at that point, he was once an NRA A-rated member. Now he's F-rated, and he's backed by David Hogg in his bid to become vice president of the United States. So the largest gun activist against the Second Amendment, he does a complete 180. I like to call him a political chameleon because he will just match the background of whatever means necessary in order to climb the political ladder. A ladder climbing Larry, we'll call him, I guess. But in the instance of George Floyd and those riots, just completely inadequate. And there's really no other way to mince words about it. And I believe Stephanie's the name of the woman in that video. I've never met Stephanie personally, but I actually know her pastor. And here in Wright County, we share a border with Hennepin in Minneapolis. This is the most conservative county in the state of Minnesota. They are the most liberal, and just a river separates the two of them, which is dramatic. But you can also just tell between the responses. In this county, where we have conservative leadership, our sheriff was already ready. We had one of the larger strip malls in the state of Minnesota. He already had a dozen patrolmen right in that parking lot on the county line, ready to roll if the protesters crossed that river line. In Hennepin County, it just wasn't the case. And they weren't prepared for any of it. And quite frankly, I would say they encouraged it. They encouraged this violence because it was political. There was a political election in 2020, and they needed to actually create chaos, quite frankly. And you can see it in the members that they elected. Rep. John Thompson's a great example, where he actually went to the front steps of the home of the Minneapolis union representative in Hugo, Minnesota, and he called them racist white people, and that they were talking to the Klansmen of Minnesota right there on his front porch in front of his family and friends and neighbors, threatening to burn down Hugo, Minnesota, on the suburbs. These are just, quite frankly, radical people. And Tim Walz endorsed that man, by the way, Representative John Thompson, who also had allegations of beating his wife at the time. They're just very radical people, and the Democrat Socialists of America here in Minneapolis, they're radical, and they encouraged all of this. And to this day, me and my wife just pulled up into Minneapolis this last week to go meet some family, and the businesses are still boarded up. It's been 4 years, and they're still boarded up to this day. There's just no excuse for any of it. And I remember it very vividly. George Floyd actually died on my birthday, May 25th. Remember it very vividly. Me and my wife and our newborn child went to go see a waterfall just a little bit south of Minneapolis at the time. And I got the notification on my phone and I saw the video and I said, this isn't going to be good. And I lived through a handful of these situations with MPD. And, sometimes they're in the wrong, sometimes they're in the right. And in this case, I just knew, regardless of the facts, this was going to be bad. And sure enough, for 4 consecutive nights, Minneapolis burned. And there's just no excuse for it. I had family that were a part of that National Guard response who served overseas. And quite frankly, they weren't that impressed with the response. And even to the point where individuals within the Walz administration, I won't say specific names, just to keep them a little bit on the safer side, not blow them up completely. They were coordinating with DSA and the Democratic Socialists of America and Antifa on when the National Guard would actually deploy. So they were coordinating at this point. And a documentary I recommend all your viewers to watch actually is The Fall of Minneapolis. The individual, Rep. John Thompson, where he went to the door of the union rep for MPD, his wife actually hosts that documentary and goes into deep detail on everything regarding the riots. And it's just saddening. I mean, 4 years later, we're still in this situation. George Floyd Square is still closed off.
Tell me, I want to make sure I get this right. What was it about the border? You said there were like police lined up on one side of the county line. Was that what you're saying?
Yeah, Wright County, Minnesota. So our sheriff, Sean Derringer, he's one of the higher reps in the Sheriff's Association here in the state of Minnesota. Very highly educated, very conservative, constitutionalist sheriff, was ready to go. We here in Wright County, we value law enforcement, and our law enforcement values our public safety. So there was already sheriff deputies all across that line ready to go. We have the largest patrol division in the state of Minnesota, despite only being closer to 10 in actual population. We have the largest patrol division, and that's just conservative leadership. That's the difference between protecting your citizens and not. And Hennepin County has 3 of the largest police agencies in the state of Minnesota, and absolutely no response at all. And whether that be blamed or on the mayor or the Tim Walz, the governor, they share a little bit of that blame, but ultimately the buck stops with the governor of Minnesota. He had access to the National Guard, and he had access to the State Patrol, and did nothing about it.
Amazing. I got about 2 minutes. Tell me about George Floyd Square.
Yeah, so George Floyd Square, I probably visited there 6 times now. I haven't gone back in about 1.5 years now to this point. And for a while, it was fairly, I would say, safe, as long as you were friendly with the locals. But then one other time when we were shooting a video for a candidate in George Floyd Square, one of the cashiers of Cup Foods, not Cub, Cup Foods, came out screaming at a young child, accusing them of stealing. And then the father of that child came up and approached the clerk owner, and they started getting in a physical altercation. And of course, no police response, because it's a closed off designated area where law enforcement is not welcome. At one point, for a consecutive amount of years, emergency services wouldn't be willing to cross into the designated zone because they feared for their lives. People would have to have bloody bodies pulled out of the designated square in order to receive emergency services. And that's how wild it has gotten to this point. Now it's softened quite a bit. You can drive through it now, but everything still remains, and it's still a massive danger zone for people. And to this day, we're still seeing the effects of Tim Walz's leadership here in Minnesota. And quite frankly, I hope the national scale does not allow him to get away with his radical record, because quite frankly, he's Gavin Newsom, but worse, just with less hair, and he wears a lot more flannel.
Dustin Grage, please follow him on Twitter. don't know if there's anyone better that has all the background than Dustin, Grage, Dustin on Twitter. Dustin, great to talk to you, man. Thank you for all your work.